Welcome. My name is Linda Ng, National President of OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates. I would like to express my sincere appreciation to you who are here for the third webinar of OCA National Convention Series. We'll be presenting the series throughout the year in recognition and celebration of OCA being founded 50 years ago in 1973. OCA's 50th anniversary is a time to join together and remind us of our rich history with a strong commitment to advocacy. How inspiring it would be then to engage our community and partners across the country with a series of conversations on issues and policies we dedicated ourselves to. This month's webinars, Sustaining Our People and Our Land, will illuminate how much of environmental sustainability and advocacy for the AAPI community. They are interconnected and why both are extremely important to all of us. We only have one planet to call home. And as our population expands in unprecedented numbers, our environmental resources are shrinking at alarming rates. Now, it is the time for action, making better choices and stewardship for our communities and the environment. Just as advocacy is about social justice and equality, environmental justice is about fair treatment and seek to address the inequity of environmental protection and the health of those communities. We have a tremendous amount of information to share today, so let's get started. Our moderator, Ping Luo, is an environmental humanities graduate student and Mellon Community Engagement Fellow at the University of Utah. For his Mellon Fellowship, he partners with OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates Utah chapter, to bridge environmental and sustainability resources and relationships to the Utah, Asian, and Pacific Islander community. Hank is also supporting evaluation and engagement initiatives for the NSF-funded Coastal Ocean Assessment for Sustainability and Transformation project, where he hopes to identify synergies for best science communication and engagement practices across various locales, including the Salt Lake Valley, Chesapeake Bay, Manila Bay, Tokyo Bay, and Gold Coast. His background and passions include plastics reduction and circular economy advocacy, as well as equity-framed community organizing. Wow, that's very impressive, Hank. So everyone, please give Hank a big, warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Linda, for that generous introduction. Yes, I saw some folks, please drop down kind of where you're joining us from. That's very exciting for us, me as moderators, OCA staff, and panelists to see who's here. So thank you, Linda, again for that. And hi, Annyeong, everyone. My name is Ping Luo, or Ping Lao, and thank you so much for joining us. We are hoping to have a casual and fun conversation this evening on this very wide topic of sustaining our people and our land. And I'm very excited to share kind of the panelists with you very soon. But just real quick, my pronouns are he, they, and let's get this show on the road. So we have Francis, who is a conservation outreach biologist at the Tracy Aviary Nature Center, and that's here in so-called Salt Lake City. And Francis is a zoologist, an artist, and a multiracial Chinese and Mexican poet. She currently works as I shared, the conservation outreach biologist with the Tracy Aviary in Salt Lake here. And in her position, Frances coordinates and designs community science projects, surveys local bird populations, and creates science art, which Frances, you need to share more about later because I've seen them and they're amazing and very impressive. Frances' experience also extends to kind of working with the National Park Service, to university natural history collections. She is also passionate about supporting equitable conservation programs that serve both wildlife and traditionally marginalized communities. And we also have joining us today as our second panelist, Wilson Xiong, who is a first-generation Hmong American and is currently a graduate student at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. His project is testing the efficacy of a removal method of invasive fish in the Río Piedras in Puerto Rico. Wilson has diverse experience working with a variety of species, such as, oh my gosh, I don't know how to pronounce this. Is it the coqui? Okay, coqui, which are native Puerto Rican frogs, elk, shorebirds, and fish. And in his free time, he enjoys fishing, hunting, hiking, and traveling. And so very, very exciting panelists we have today for you all. And so I'm also looking forward to a lot of questions for them. Today we have, again, a grand topic around kind of Asian American, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander advocacy. Where does that kind of intersect with environmental sustainability? Thinking about those intersections, but also kind of diving deeper into what and how those connections manifest in kind of the lives and experiences of our panelists, Frances and Wilson. And so, yeah, let's get this started with maybe some introductions from Wilson and Frances themselves. Wilson, if you don't mind, we'll start with you. Anything you want to expand on that maybe I haven't covered, maybe share more about kind of some depth into the research that you're doing, what industry you're in within this broad environmental climate conservation kind of category as well.
Yeah, thank you, Peng. So my name is Wilson Xiong, currently a grad student at University of Tennessee, and mostly my concentration in the conservation field is fisheries, but I have broad experience in other parts of the conservation field. So my project is testing out the efficacy of a removal method in Puerto Rico. So there's these two invasive fish that we're looking at, the armor catfish, also known as planko, or the red devils, or the also known as like Amphilophus cichlid. And these two fish got introduced in Puerto Rico through the pet trade, and then they got released in the reservoirs. And then as things went, go in tropical storms, they kind of got into the streams, and now they're booming in the streams, and they are affecting the native population of the native fish there. And so my project is to see, by removing them, how do the native fish rebound back to that, or respond to the removal of the invasive fish. But a little more background, I did my undergrad at North Carolina State University, graduated with a bachelor's in fisheries and conservation biology and a minor in applied ecology. Then after that, I lived in Puerto Rico for a couple months doing the frog work, as Peng mentioned, and then I started moving around. I lived in California for about 4 years, working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and also for UC Davis, working on multiple projects in the the San Joaquin River and the Sacramento River, and basically all Northern California.
Awesome, super exciting. I picked out a few things to maybe follow up on after we hear from Frances. Anything else to share that I didn't cover? I mean, everything else that I didn't cover.
Well, I guess it's like in my current position, as a conservation outreach biologist, I'm sort of in the middle of both doing field work and field research as it relates to conservation, specifically bird conservation here in Salt Lake County. But I also do a lot of outreach and education. So building community science programs, talking to new communities, doing outreach. So sort of the best of both worlds, I like to think. So doing the science and hands-on research, and then getting to talk to people about like why conservation is so cool. But yeah, that's me currently.
Awesome. Thanks for that extension to the introduction, Francis. Yeah, maybe we'll start with me just following up really quick on maybe just a few of the things you mentioned, both of you mentioned. Wilson, you kind of just mentioned the pet trade, right? I think let's dive right in terms of, I think there's a lot of terminology, right, around native, around what's native, right, around what's invasive. And we get a lot of these language that's normalized through kind of Western education, but we know that it's a lot more complex than that, as kind of, we are in kind of also predominantly white, predominantly Western systems of learning. And with that comes a lot of need for unlearning as well, right? As we navigate these spaces and grow in these spaces. And so I know there's a lot with kind of Puerto Rico there in terms of like politics, economy, kind of on the realms of like colonialism, capitalism, and in relation, Wilson, to also kind of your work, right? I mean, we look at what we so-called natural disasters and how that impacts kind of pets, like fishes as pets, and how that also becomes a conservation in a larger kind of like institutionally government funded project, essentially, right? And so can you share kind of a little more, maybe more on like your project and what that entails? Maybe like any interesting experiences there, maybe that lends to your thoughts on kind of like research, but also like native and invasive, so-called invasive species as well. And Francis, of course, would love any input on this too.
Yeah, so Puerto Rico is a pretty interesting place because it's it's a U.S. territory, but they have their own government. But there's a lot of things that there's similarities in the U.S. The main state, and then the island of Puerto Rico. So my project is fully funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so the federal government, and also part is funded by the Department of Natural Resources in Puerto Rico. And the thing interesting about this project is that, like, most of the time when you have invasive, it's kind of hard to remove these invasive fish because there's a bigger story, to my part of my project, because mine's only concentrate on one river system in Puerto Rico. And then there's a side project that I did is to see the disperse of these invasive fish within the island. And out of like the 32 streams that I monitored or look over, I think over 80% of them have these fish in there, these invasive fish, these two invasive fish. And the thing is, like, once they're in there, they're kind of hard to remove because a lot of these streams, rivers, there's a reservoir atop, and we're not doing anything to monitor or control the population in the reservoir. So what I'm talking about is, like, example, you can clean up the river and and remove all the invasive in the river as much as possible. But if you have a source, that they're thriving and there's nothing we're doing to eradicate them or control them. And then when these dams release water, these species are just going to come back. And that's a difficult thing to do because there's a lot of money behind it, a lot of politics behind it, and sometimes, to be honest, invasives are not as bad as we pertain it to be. And that's a concept that I think a lot of Westerners don't understand, is that, not all invasive are bad, and and the native fish in Puerto Rico, they're all either catadromous or anadromous, meaning that they need access from freshwater to saltwater to complete their life cycle. So, and throughout the Caribbean island, all the native species in Puerto Rico thrives in other places like Cuba, Dominican Republic, Dominica, and Belize. So there's always going to be a recruitment somewhere, and they're always going to be there, I'll say, in Puerto Rico, even though the invasive is still there.
Yeah, thanks for that, sharing that too. I think one thing I'd like to also hear, if you have anything to share on that too, is like, I think it's interesting. I mean, we think of federal funding, how Puerto Rico's, not recognized, as one of the 50 states, but is also under, US kind of governance and territory. And so on that topic too, right? I mean, I think there's like federal funding that's being administered to do research that you're conducting, right? And thinking about different priorities for Puerto Rico and the communities that live there too, right? That I think we can relate to a lot of kind of colonial imperial extensions to a lot of Asian, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander geographies as well, right? Do you have kind of any thoughts there in terms of like, can the federal government, or maybe particularly US Fish and Wildlife, are there different priorities maybe there that, obviously this is an interest of yours why you're in your program too, but thinking strategic, or thinking more kind of about like prioritization of funding and use of funding, do you ever kind of think about what that looks like in terms of like community need and that justice piece that Puerto Rico is always talked about in deficit of, right? And so wanting to hear kind of your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, so I think sometimes the project that I seen or done in Puerto Rico, it's not prioritized to the people of Puerto Rico or the public. It's just these people who has these ideas, who writes these grants, and then submits it to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and then all of a sudden it gets funded, and it doesn't benefit the people of Puerto Rico, or the government, or or Puerto Rico itself. So sometimes I question some of these projects that goes on in Puerto Rico, and how funding is spread out through the island, and also to who it's given to. Because to me, I'm very very like cultural stuff, and I understand like Puerto Rico has been through a lot of persecution and colonialism. So to me, like, I always tell all the Puerto Ricans, like when I work with them, like, I wish most time, like, I wish a Puerto Rican would have done this project instead of me, because it's not, why I say that is because my cultural background is not my land, it's not my country, you know what I mean? So I'm like, why didn't we just get someone who's native in Puerto Rico and let them do it? I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm blessed to have this project, but I think, to be all honest, I'd rather have someone a Boricua, who is really there from Puerto Rico, because I believe is their country, and then they will appreciate it more, and they'll appreciate they would probably appreciate the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the federal government more by supporting them, giving a Puerto Rican like the project. And that's things that I see, the government that I wish they could do more is to promote, the places that they're going to fund, let the people of the place, take over and help and run it instead of someone who's not like a native from Puerto Rico.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for expanding on that too. And Francis, let's kind of let me follow up on something you brought up, and which I find also very exciting and very tied to this conversation too, right? Which is around community science programs, right? And so you're a conservation biologist, you do some field work, different from Wilson, but related, right? In terms of surveying, etc. But what does this kind of community science piece look like for your work? What brought you to it? How's it going? Where is it going?
Yeah, I guess in my current line of work, so the Tracy Aviary's Conservation Department is focused a lot on local bird conservation. So this is species that are like literally in people's backyards here in the Salt Lake Valley. And we have about 7 different community science programs because technically our department is only 4 people for the amount of different projects that we work on. We rely really heavily on community involvement. So for example, our biggest sort of survey, which is happening now, is our breeding season survey, which is we are going out to different plots of like habitats or land management areas, or municipalities have asked us to come in and look at bird populations and the effects of restoration on bird species. And so to do that, we have to go out really early in the morning and essentially do these counts where we're looking and listening for any and all bird species that we can in a allotted amount of time. But we have so many different sites to cover that we rely very heavily on a team of volunteers that we recruit from the community. And usually when we put out these calls, we're like, hey, if you're interested in birds, you don't have to know anything about birds, but like come and work with us. Like we put them through a training process and we're like, yeah, technically anybody can be a scientist. Like it doesn't matter, like if you have the training, we just want you to be interested in birds and you are helping in the capacity that you can. So they are able to be trained to become these community scientists. And that is kind of like one of our most rigorous community science programs. But we also have other programs where people can just like jump in for the day and they're like, oh, I'm just interested in what y'all are doing. Like our Alta Nest Box project is a good example of that. We have songbird and owl nest boxes placed up in some of the ski resorts to monitor like what species are nesting there, how can management be sort of shifted around to accommodate some of these species. And we'll go and snowshoe out there with a giant painter's pole and a little GoPro strapped to it to peek inside the nest boxes. And so usually when we call for volunteers, we're just like, hey, if you're interested in like learning more about this, like just come join us for the day. It doesn't have to be a big commitment. So we have a whole wide range of ways that people can get involved. And I guess in particular for me, we have started a new community science program called Birds and Beavers, or Castores y Comunidad, which is meant to be a bilingual Spanish-English community science program at our newest Jordan River Nature Center. And with that program, we're really interested in reaching the Latinx community who lives around the Jordan River Nature Center and really acknowledging that in the past, Tracy Aviary's audience has been very affluent and white. So recognizing that, that is also reflected in our patrons and also our volunteers. So thinking, how can we start building new community science programs from the ground up that really include what the community wants and needs, is accessible to them, and sort of serves both like the interests of the community and wildlife. So that's currently where I'm at.
Awesome. Thanks for expanding on that too. And I think, I think where we might want to take the conversation next that also might appeal to maybe some of the folks who are joining us today virtually too. Again, please pop some questions into the chat. We'll have a short Q&A towards kind of the end of the webinar here. But I'm also interested in a question for the both of you, right? Like, I think there's the lack of disaggregated data in terms of census, in terms of like demographics, also, and I think when I think of that, I also think about how that plays out in the environmental sustainability conservation fields as well, right? And how that informs, or if it informs, right, how what research projects, are kind of formulated, right, and proposed, right, for funding. What research is being done, but also what kind of programming is also serving like local, like, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, right? And, I think one thing to note, since I'm in the same city, Salt Lake City, as you are, Francis too, right? Like there's a huge, like Pacific Islander community here, huge Tongan and Samoan community, but also a huge hub of immigrants and refugees, right? And so I think there's a lot of ties there in terms of like different geographies and maybe some of both of your experiences in navigating this field. And so I'd like to hear a little more on kind of like your backgrounds, your relation to kind of where you've seen areas in the conservation sustainability field that has served maybe AAPI and Native Hawaiian communities or not, right? Like, let's have that conversation too, right? And just to preface that really quick too, I'm coming from a point of, that's also why I chose OCA, kind of the Utah chapter, as my Mellon community engagement project, right, in my environmental humanities program, is because I personally, having been in the field, having studied it in undergrad, but also having been a professional in the environmental sector for a few years, I see very little services, advocacy for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander advocacy and resources, right? And so definitely would love to hear your thoughts, your insight, where we're at, where your experiences lend into kind of that conversation too. And whoever's ready, feel free to go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, what? Sorry. I guess when we're thinking about what sort of programs are funded, at least when I'm thinking about bird research and bird conservation, a lot of programs. So the aviary, for example, does provide conservation grants and funding to other organizations who are doing bird conservation. But I think for the most part, there's an emphasis on species that are within the US and the Americas, just because geographically, that is sort of how birds are connected throughout our portion of like the Western Hemisphere. So I think there is that. So we don't have a lot of connectivity with, I guess, the other side. Like there are many bird species, and there are some bird species in Tracy Aviary's care. For example, the Vietnam pheasant that does have ties to like other Asian countries. But I think currently our like conservation focus isn't as heavily on those species, just because we have a lot of connectivity like with like Western US species. But I also think in terms of like, when we think about like community outreach, community science programs that could be tied back to like the vast amount of people that we have here in Salt Lake City, I think it is also, unfortunately, like this field is very white. So I think sometimes people literally just don't think about that. Oh my God. Yeah, I think the capacity building is a big thing. So we recently hired a new director of culture, which is very exciting. And he's been working to build some programs with the Pacifica community. And I think before that, it was just me currently trying to build relations with other POC communities. So if you think about just like the amount of staff people that we have who have that like background knowledge and connections to community, like who can go into these spaces and be a trusted person. Like, I think it is very hard for white environmentalists, even if they mean well, to go into these spaces and be like, hey, like to try to start building those relations. So I think there's a lot to be said about like looking for people who have that cultural knowledge to be in these organizations and in these positions of power to build trust with communities.
Yeah, thanks, Francis, for that. I just want to highlight like the states that I've seen like that were conservation, supports a lot of minorities or people of color is states that have people of color in power politically. That's where I see most of where conservation is pushed, towards or accepted more towards the people of color or people of less privilege, I'll say. Like example, California and Minnesota and New York, I see that because there's a lot of political power in these diverse communities, and then that's where I see where most of the voice are heard because of someone in the political power comes from a different background than white, and then they put their input in there, and then the ball rolls from there, So, and then you have all these other states that doesn't have as much diverse, people. Example, Tennessee or the Southeast, some of the Midwest states, like is majority white, and you see less of these, outreach programs, these, translation of, hunting, fishing regulations or conservation of conservation regulations. And I think that's the thing that we gotta understand is like, most of conservationists are white, yes, and they're just there for the job. And that's a sad thing to say, but they just doing the minimum to get by. And as a people of color, someone, we have to do more than majority of the white people. I mean, that's just how it is because, we understand people who are not privileged. And when we see that, we can engage, like Francis, we can engage with them better. And because we have similar backgrounds and we can understand where they're coming from, and because I worked in this field for over 10 years, and I see that with my coworkers, everywhere I go, it's like if it's person of color, they won't talk to them, or they just try to basically run away from them, like because they're afraid to that initiation, or they're afraid to they're like overthink like, oh, they're a person of color, how do I interact with them? I'm like, they're just human, just like us, just treat them the same and just talk to them. Or they talk to you, just talk to them like anyone else, even though if they can't, speak your language or you can't understand them, at least acknowledge that, you acknowledge their presence or you're trying to understand it. I think that goes a lot more into like the social and dynamics of what we're missing in this field.
Yeah, I think that's great. And that brings us to kind of the topic of like, I mean, nationally, if not globally, we see this adoption of diversity, equity, inclusion, right? And as I think for the three of us Asian Americans, right? Like what does that look like for you as you're navigating, I think, Wilson, you and me, academia, but also, I mean, Francis, you too, and, you're currently in also like a nonprofit, also community-based structure, right? But also speaking to your experiences too, right? Like, if you don't mind, maybe like either of you sharing, or both of you sharing like, kind of how are you navigating that, right? How did you navigate it? How are you navigating it? And maybe there's someone in the audience or someone who's going to listen to this who also identifies as like Asian American, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander this might inform kind of how they go about kind of these I guess industries or fields as well, right? So if any of you want to speak to any of that.
I guess one of the biggest things, like through navigating that, is finding community. Like, I think you need to find community with other like POC, sort of just like as a way to sort of nourish and sustain yourself as you're like talking through some of these changes. You're like, hey, like, are you also feeling this, or do you have expertise in this? Like, if someone has worked in your organization like longer than you have, finding that solidarity. But I guess also in terms of sort of pushing for more DEI, I think one of the things that I like to like have as an example is making very intentional, like bringing very intentional ideas for growth to your organization. So like, for example, the Conservation Committee has like a pool of small funds that we use for small projects, conservation, etc. And so at our most recent Conservation Committee meeting, I was like, hey, I noticed we have this like small section that we allot for scholarships, but we haven't been really like using it that much. Like, what is the status of this? I'm like, and the committee was like, oh yeah, so we kind of had that set aside, but we haven't done much work on that. And so at the next meeting, I proposed, okay, so this is something that we are very interested in sustaining. What if we put that like money towards supporting scholarships for students of color, for people who may not have the same opportunities and access to enter into this field? So very much pitching that idea, also backing it up with research, like the people in power love research, but saying, hey, things like this like work, and we need this because our marginalized communities need that extra support. And if we are really committed to diversity and justice in this field, we need to put our money where we say we are committing to. So that, I think, is one example of navigating DEI. Another one is we at the aviary have been like restructuring and looking at sort of like how we go through the hiring process. So that's another thing, is saying, hey, hiring bias and like internal bias is obviously a thing that happens, and bringing forth to all of our hiring managers, here's some of the best practices, and also being like, look, our organization is very white. That's kind of a problem if we're trying to reach new communities. So going forward, here are some actionable steps that we're going to be taking to reflect on some of the processes that have and have not worked in the past, and like thinking about ways that we can grow. And so one of the like easiest suggestions that I made in that meeting was like, where are we posting our jobs? Like, are we posting to very targeted job boards? Like Texas A&M Wildlife Job Board is a big one in the wildlife field. But I'm like, okay, but how about, have we considered posting to like Latino Outdoors? Have we considered posting to like this Queer Outdoors network? Like being very targeted about who we want to reach, and also working on taking a look at internal culture and being like, are these people safe when they come into our organization? So having those hard conversations with people and being like, listen, we all want to do better, but we need to have actionable steps to do that. And this is how we're going to do that.
Yeah, that's you're right, Francis. Like, you know, if we want to bring in people, you know, we got to make them feel comfortable and be known. And I think that's the thing we're missing in this field, you know, which is what white dominant is, that they talk, but they don't walk the walk. You know, that's all mostly what it is. Because a lot of, you know, colonialism in the Western world, they're all about the feelings and the hiding, you know, behind the truth in this field. Like, yes, it's white dominant. If you know that, then why don't you do something about it? Like, and that's the thing that frustrates me. It's like, okay, you talk about it, you're going to do something, but you don't do anything about it to fix the problem. And that's why, for me, what I see is that I got to be in a position to be who has power, because you can voice all you want, but if they don't, if you're below them, you're not in power, they don't really care. I mean, that's just how it is. Like, you know, like that's just how our system is built, and that's how it is, and that's how you got to play it and make it, and then you can do what you can. I mean, I'm just saying, don't burn out. Don't try to, you still got to be you, but still, I mean, it's a fighting battle, and this is how it is. I mean, not just this field. I mean, you look at other fields, the medical field, the engineering field, that same thing happened too. And we're just now, to be in conservation, like I tell a lot of conservation, it's a privilege to have conservation, period. You don't see other countries, like third world countries, you don't see them doing conservation work like how we do in the US. It's not a degree in a lot of places. It's not a job in a lot of places. It's a livelihood. It's a way of life. And that's the thing Western conservation has to understand, is that it's a privilege to conserve natural resource, while other places, they're part of the ecosystem. They're thriving, they're surviving, they're with, the natural resources. And that's the thing that we Western conservation got to understand, is that a lot of this stuff are, cater to Western society, and things are growing, and we're getting more diverse, and we need to understand that and respect that, the white way is not always the right way, and we have to fix that. And the way to fix that, I believe, is like, you just got to keep pushing at it and having these meetings like this, but also having, for what I do is like having white people and talk to them one-on-one and explaining things. I don't like it when it's a group, because when you have a group, they can overpower you. And that's why I don't really like doing it, talking in a big group, because it goes haywire when there's big groups. I just say that because I've done a lot of these, seen it and done a lot of these diversity stuff. And then when you have a lot of them, it's like you're attacking them. But I'm like, no, it's not like that. We're just trying to tell you, hey, this is what's up.
Yeah, thank you both for kind of sharing those experiences too. And I think, you both allude to a lot of like culture, right? It's important to acknowledge who you're surrounded by, who you're comfortable with, and I think that's what a lot of like, not only like AANH, like PIs, community members also, and POCs navigate, but just kind of like identifying those cracks and those gaps and those opportunities, right? To leverage opportunity, to leverage your own voice and your own values. I think, unfortunately, that's the reality of like a lot of, I think, what we're all struggling to do. And I think, obviously, Francis, you pointed to a lot of kind of like structural needs, that just like across all of our fields, and public health, social services, etc., like that needs to be best practices, and it's not, right? And it continues to pose as really like damage kind of serving practices, right, and systems. And so I think you both addressed some of the questions that already have come up from some people in the chat, kind of around like navigating that. Before we get to Q&A, we maybe have like, maybe we got like one or two more questions we could get through. I'm thinking, I think some of the questions here surround too, where have you seen opportunities that allow for kind of like the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities to be involved, right? Like where are those in solid existence? Where are they in the gaps and the cracks, right? And maybe if I can ask you two to also reflect on like, how you've come to be where you are in identity, but also in career, in study, etc.
I guess, finding conservation groups that supports people of color in a diverse background. I think, like, the example, like all like me, Peng, and Francis, we all met through the Doris Duke Conservation Scholar Program, and the programs like that, or like Seeds, that promotes, people of color or Asian Pacific Islanders. Like these programs, I think, are the ones that are gonna, make you feel, known and also heard. And through these programs, I believe, these are great ways to find connections to others and be a part of and strive for more and hopefully, work a way where, you also support your community and also others who are also coming along, in this field.
I guess I also see opportunity in sort of reframing what we think of as conservation, because I think in like this very Western Eurocentric world, we think of conservation as like one field, and we sort of think, oh, if you are doing X thing, then that is conservation. But we don't always recognize conservation could be like saving and recycling those like cookie tins, spreading coffee grounds in the garden, like taking public transit. So conservation, I think, doesn't always have to mean you are going out and you are going to save this very particular endangered species of bird. Maybe conservation also includes like retelling some of the old ancestral stories that you have about knowledge, like about species, plants, birds, etc., cultural stories that are relevant to, the environment that your parents grew up in, that you grew up in. I know. So I think I see a lot of opportunity in expanding the definition of conservation. I also see it a lot in community organizing, that yes, sometimes it can be frustrating to work within agencies and like formal organizations, but like us as professionals, we have that knowledge and it doesn't just have to stay within our organization. Like it can be partnered with other organizations that maybe are not conservation related, but environmental and social justice are very much intertwined. So bringing that sort of expertise to maybe like outdoors groups who are interested in like reaching new communities. And you're like, hey, like if I went to a new outdoors group, like Latino Outdoors, and I was like, hey, like you all do a lot of cool things. I have this bird knowledge. Do you want me to lead a bird walk? And like I can bring that expertise to a community group. And that sort of can work in many different ways. So yeah, just reaching out to the communities you do know and working in sort of informal systems, I think.
Absolutely. Thanks for shedding some light on that too, Francis. Yeah, I think it's really important, right, for us to acknowledge like what are formal ways of understanding like involvement and integration, but also thinking about like less informal, because there's I hate to use like there's this built hierarchy, right, of conservationism, environmentalisms, sustainability, everything, right? From, people or companies who are extracting, who's producing material, like the shift of the weight of now from consumers, for example, with plastics consumption, right? To like actually, if people would stop producing it, like, maybe we're producing things that we could use in a more sustainable way, right? There's a lot going on there politically too, right? And so whether that looks like civic engagement, right? Like casting a vote, whether that looks like joining more of these webinars and learning through them, right? And learning kind of what action steps there are, whether it is, if you're in academia or you want to join a program that's like, already kind of existing, like the Doors to Conservation Scholars Program that all three of us were a part of, separate times, different programs as well, or other kind of up and coming, right? That's another big thing, right? Is with this big equity, diversity, inclusion push is also coming these wonderful opportunities that are showing up for the AAPI community too, right? So that is a reality. I think, from being a graduate student myself, right? Like I see that rising, which is absolutely amazing in terms of opportunity and navigating differences and privileges for our communities. And so absolutely, thanks for navigating that, sharing kind of that. And kind of, let's see, we can kind of also transition into kind of some chats and questions that have come in. Thank you, everyone, for contributing. Let's see, people want to also learn more about, yeah, I mean, is there anything more to add that either of you want to add kind of on your identities and how you navigate space in career, in academia? I mean, I could speak to it too. Obviously, I'm a grad student, but yeah, I'll hand it off to you first to kind of expand on that, and especially thinking about the intersection of our identities with these different fields and the different work that we do. Yeah, go ahead.
Be proud of your identity. Don't be ashamed of tell people who you are and what your background is. Because every culture, every person is very beautiful, and then they got their own ways of seeing conservation. And without all of us together, the world couldn't be what it is today. And don't hide from your identity. Show it, live proud, and go at it and show the world.
And how are you doing that, Wilson?
Yeah, everyone I go talk to, I always, wear my Hmong, lock. And also I talk about my culture. That's one way. And I explain how my culture sees conservation and how, how they use like a certain plant or species to, do herbal medicine, or how they used to, say harvest a species and what it's used for like, who's good for housing for the body and medical uses. So that's how I, promote my culture and my identity.
Okay. Well, I guess in my case, my identity, like being multiracial, both Chinese and Mexican, I don't know, I think a lot about it influencing sort of my interest in different bird species. Like if you think about like through art or through research, it's like there are a lot of cultural stories and like a lot of cultural meaning behind different like bird species, etc. And I think that is something that people don't always think about in conservation. Like when we're trying to do outreach programs, it's always like, where does this bird live? What do they eat? What is their conservation status? Which is interesting, yes, but I think it's also when I am in these spaces, it's also sort of bringing that sort of story, like what sort of makes it more alive to people that you're trying to reach when you talk about maybe the golden eagle and you're just like, you're talking about population numbers, yes, but you're also very much talking about a symbol that has a lot of story, a lot of cultural connection. So I think it's like sort of bringing your own cultural knowledge and stories to the things that you work with. And I think that is something that I think about a lot, especially like in art.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Francis. Yeah, I mean, if I could share quickly too, I mean, I think one thing that I've really learned in this field is like valuing like deep reflection and keeping an open mind and allowing for like organic lessons and collaborations to allow for kind of like ourselves to kind of grow and blossom too, right? I mean, I go by Ping lore, my Hmong and then my American last name, my Hmong first name, American last name, I mean, that alone, right? I think being in this field, and thinking about topics of native, invasive, like thinking about my family's own like refugee and immigrant experience, how my parents don't call me Ping, they call me Ping, right? Maybe sound a little, similar to you, but there's a difference, right? And so like learning to honor my own identity as I navigate spaces like this, as I complicate, like my own name for everybody else too, right? But nonetheless, right? it's something I value, and this is how I want to carry kind of my identity around in these spaces, even though it disrupts what's so common. Not that they pronounce Pang anyways, because my American name is spelled P-H-E-N-G, so everybody's like Fang, right? And so, kind of back to kind of like these different layers of kind of like Western associations, and so just wanted to share that too. I think, yeah, as we're very nearing kind of the half-hour mark here, let's jump into some of these last questions, and maybe if we want to answer them briefly too, Francis and Wilson. Oh my gosh, big question. On the onslaught of natural disasters we have seen in recent years, what can we do to address climate change? Big question, brief responses. What do we got?
That's a hard question. I'll tell you that. Oh man. I guess to really address it, you kind of more the political side. Like, I think that's how the best way to go about it. I mean, we have all this data, but if you have no political power or no influence, it won't get addressed. And that's just how it is in our field. I've seen drought years in fisheries, and nothing happens because the ones who's in control don't address it to the higher ups, and it's sad, but that's usually how it is in our field.
I guess I would think about it through like two avenues, one being community organizing with other people who also are like, hey, obviously this is a problem, and what are we doing about it? And finding and sort of nourishing that energy to keep like fighting these battles. But then also definitely taking some like civic and political action. Like when there are bills, like for example, I think there was like a bill about like putting a gondola to go through one of the mountains here in Salt Lake City, and there was a public comment period. So definitely keeping things like that on your radar and letting the people like the transit department and the government know that that is not something that we want. So in relation to like big climate like laws that are being passed, or big climate like bills and changes, like keeping those on your radar, and if you have the capacity to, definitely putting in your 2 cents and organizing with other people to be like, hey, this is happening. Let's make sure people know and can attend these things so that we are making it very clear.
Absolutely. Yeah. Echoing both Wilson and Francis, right? I mean, I think what you both are also just alluding to is like every momentum, like all forms of progress is important. Again, whether that is making sure a small piece of plastic gets actually to the trash, you at least did your part, right? Versus like throwing it on the street, and it going in sewer systems and eventually out into the ocean, right? Like that's an impact that you have already made, and it's a conscious choice, right? And so whether it's going out to vote, whether it is learning more, again, through attending webinars like this, asking questions like the questions you all are asking now, like that's a start, right? And I think with any field, knowledge is power, as is agency. And so definitely want to encourage you all to keep asking these questions. We do have a question. I think I'll just answer this really quickly around national parks, what they're doing with DEI. How do we get more folks to work in the field? I think that wonderful question. It could be a whole entirely different webinar. I know Wilson has a lot to say about the federal government, but I will just briefly say the national park system is within the Department of Interior, which has an awesome leader right now, Secretary Deb Haaland, who's doing amazing work bridging Indigenous kind of partnership with the Bureau of Land Management and the federal government in terms of national park and preservation efforts too, right? And so there's been kind of depending on politics, waves of DEI initiatives going in and out of the park leadership, which if you kind of just Google, you'll find some information on that too. But with respect to time, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Keep them coming. Reach out to us if there are any questions, lingering questions, or if we can kind of point you to the right direction if you know anyone who's trying to build community, to get to know each other, but to also be in the space, right? To navigate the space in the ways that we've been talking about. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Thank you, Francis and Wilson and OCA National for hosting this. And yeah, we'll end it off there. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night. Happy Earth Month, even though every day is Earth Day. And yes, have a great evening, and get some rest.
Wow, thank you to our amazing panel, Payne, Francis, and Wilson, for sharing your insight on culture, good citizenship, and environmental conservation and sustainability. This is really, such an excellent session. Thank you all so much for joining us this month's OCA National Conversation Seminar. And for anyone who missed tonight's webinar, we'll be posting the recording on our YouTube channel at OCA National. Now, our next OCA National Conversation Series will be on May 23rd, same time, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Our topic for the month is to be announced. So be on the lookout on our newsletters, social media, Instagram, Facebook, and more. This conversation series to get folks ready for our 50th National Convention happening July 12th through 16th this summer at the Capitol Hilton, Washington, D.C. Registration is open now, so you can find more information on OCA National Convention.org. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight, and you have a very good evening. We'll see you next time. Good night.